Welcome back to the Vintage Metagame Monday for May 10th. So last week, unfortunately, I had to miss the recording because I was quite sick, and by the time that my voice recovered, it was a little too stale to do the Vintage Metagame Monday. So just to compensate for that, I'm going to go a little deeper today on what happened, and boy, it was a great week to be brewing. As we'll see, there was a lot of different takes on different decks, and we're starting to see the emergence of flow state decks, or how flow state is being used in certain decks. So we'll talk a little bit about that. In terms of just the pure results, on Thursday we had Flashbreaker taking it after beating Esper Loros. Friday we had just Fear Shops winning over Oath. On Saturday, our own DFA won the challenge with Loros Doomsday over a blue-white control list with Wan Shitong, and I believe it was Standard Trap Trainer. We'll take a look at this deck. And then on the Sunday morning challenge, we also had Suasa Cat also winning with Loros Doomsday, basically the same list, I believe, as DFA, winning over Loros PL. So let's start moving the decks to their respective places. It's going to be a little strange this time because a lot of things there's a lot of like brews more than normal generally. So we'll take a look at some of these. So a couple of brews that I want to talk about. We had two different versions of like blue-white Lurus. The first one was trying to take advantage of Tamio and what's his name, Snapcaster Mage, stuff like that, in a heavy like counterspell removal shell. And this one was a little different with 2 One-Shotongs and 4 Thunder Trap Trainers, still also heavily utilizing flow state and a lot of like big removal suit with counterspells. We also had Sean, the Illusionist, playing this version of Breach, which is just a homage, sort of, or an adaptation of the Iggy Pop deck that they've been playing in Pre-Modern. Basically, you are trying to play Infernal Contract, or the alternative, I believe it's called like Contract from Below or something like that. So 2 and 2. Basically, for Doomsday mana, you draw 4 cards and lose half your life. This is just straight up Gifts Breach, but instead of having mana drain and more counter spells, you're playing Dark Ritual, Infernal Contract, stuff like that. We also had a couple of interesting just blue combo decks. There was this Jewel sort of, so I guess it should be more here, like very like Jewel heavy. No, sorry, actually that was a different deck. There was this Displacer Kitten version that was playing like PO in Grixis and just trying to blink a bunch of other permanents. I mean, obviously the Displacer Kitten is broken with a lot of cards, so it's not that hard to make a deck with Displacer Kitten that kills pretty quickly. But in this case, they were trying to just blink for value for the most part. There were no infinites that I could see, but other than Tezzeret, where you just basically get all of your 0s and 1s from the deck. And just kind of like a Tinker-y PO deck, just like hard combo without lures, obviously. And then we had Chess Knight playing this sort of like blue-white initiative E. And I say that because there was like a couple of White Plume Adventurers, but overall it was just a big blue deck with like a Tinker, Bola, Citadel finish, and also White Plume Adventurer, Monastery Mentor, and Karn. So sort of like a strange place where you are also playing like Forces, Force of Negation, Force of Will, and all of that stuff, and Plows, while also trying to leverage Flow State and the Tinker package. We also had a reappearance of an old friend, Countervine, which for the past couple of weeks, I don't know if the meta was looking good for it. We were seeing a little bit of a resurgence of Frog, not that much, just like big blue combo, so not like the best for it, but we had been seeing like a drop in the Bowmaster numbers, and so this time it made it through. 3 copies of Coveted Jewel, one of which is a sort of blinky version with Hive in the ceiling and what's his name? Displacer Kitten. The rest were like just stock versions of both Seer Shops, Jewel, and Raker. and then 5 Oath of Druid versions. The majority of these are now Flow State Null Rod versions, except for one. Wrath and Mikey continues to appear here and there. But overall, again, I'm pretty sure these numbers are overrepresented at this moment. But Oath keeps putting like 5 people in top 8s consistently. We've been seeing it for a couple of weeks now, and so yeah, maybe like we need to start packing more hate for it or playing decks that beat it more often. Other things that I didn't mention, just one White Plume one initiative deck making it through. Makes sense seeing like how heavy this section and this section is, that it's starting to be very difficult to be playing initiative. A couple of Besiege the Mirror Storm decks from like Deep Blue. We saw 3 Frog decks, because these 2 that I was mentioning did not play Frog. So just 3 Frog decks, the standard like Blue-Black or an Esper, and 1 classic Drain Bridge deck, also making it on the top 8s. In terms of flow state, I think last week we were not seeing that much of an entry point of this deck, but right now we can see that very often you are going to see flow state feature in blue decks. We see 10 out of 32 top 8, so a little bit less than 30%, or like a third. But most of these Druid decks, also Druids except for one, were playing it. The 2 Loros Doomsday decks were also playing it, and I believe around here 3 or 4 of them were also playing it. So at least for the control versions of blue decks are definitely heavily leveraging flow state, which sort of makes sense. In my mind, flow state is kind of a card that wants to bridge between just like the stock up decks that also want to play Null Rod, because while you're playing Null Rod, your stock ups require your full Moxen, and so if you're also necessitating Null Rod, those can get stuck in your hand and you can have some mana problems. Flow state kind of bridges that. It is also, while not digging you as quickly or as deep, sometimes the decks that play flow state don't need to get that much card advantage, and more so they just need to find a card, basically. Like in this case, like if you're playing Oath, you just need to find the Oath or the Null Rod, depending on where you are. If you're in the Doomsday matchup, you will need, either counter spells or the ritual or whatever you need here. But also, because in Doomsday you already play Thoughtseize and Ponders and stuff, it's a very good fit, as well as we've been seeing it on the blue-black or in the Esper Frog list, where we're starting to put a couple more sorceries like Thoughtseize and stuff like that. Last episode, 2 weeks ago, I was talking about this list that my group put together. We were playing Murktides and stuff, and since the deck has been shifting a little bit more towards the Frog versions. So just looking at this from the perspective of what would you start playing. So I took a little bit of an analysis here based on like what versions are being played and which numbers. So right now we can see that the Oath decks and Jewel are kind of like a little more predominant. We'll also be having Doomsday, Stretch, POs, that sort of stuff. So from this perspective, from me, and it's a little biased, but like if I were to play, obviously I would still play Breach. But if I could play any deck right now, I would be thinking very heavily about Loros Breach. The Oath matchup is very, very good. Shops can be a little hard, but because they can go very quickly before you stabilize. But depending on the build, if you're playing 2 or 3 consigns, this improves significantly. Doomsday is actually pretty good for you. You have a lot of big tools, and especially Loros. Despite what you see here, I personally feel that Turbo Doomsday is a little harder, mostly because of Necro, but also because they can break the piles easier. You usually have Pyroblast for their frogs and stuff like that, so this can be a little easier. Also, when I show these metrics or these win rates, bear in mind that the confidence intervals can be very large. So if you're looking at this metagame dashboard from here and you come to the matchup, like you might think, oh, I have a very good matchup against Doomsday, like here, like Breach with Doomsday 68%, but like this has to be wrong. I don't think this is the deck, but basically the thing is, like, even if you see a big number, like the spread can be very wide. Like even in some of these where it's just like, oh, you might think you have a good like Lurus DRS matchup with Breach, but like the internal confidence can go from like unlosable to very hard to, or unwinnable basically. So some of these, take it with a grain of salt with this, but from personal experience, I can tell you this I feel comfortable going into. In fact, I am more afraid of Jewel than any of these two, which makes sense. PO is also fine. The Hexing Squelcher matchup has been a little hard, but you have the tools to circumvent it. Generally, you don't want to see shops and you don't want to see initiative, and even then, depending on the build, it's much easier for you. Like if you're playing a lot of consigns and or one shidong, these two matchups improve quite significantly. So right now, it does look like Breach is pretty well positioned, which of course I'm like happy to hear because it is my main deck coming up into NYSE. And what would you not want to think about? Well, I've been thinking that these kind of like blue combo decks are not really in a, at least the Tinker version is not really that well positioned. If you are thinking about things like Doomsday, you can see generally you're fine. Obviously, you don't want to play against the Lurus Doomsday because they are basically your same deck, but with a faster clock, and it's very hard to play that matchup. Any of the sphere shops, honestly, like looking at these numbers, generally it's a little hard for you, especially against Oath, and we've been seeing like a big overrepresentation of Oath. Generally, I feel in NYSE you also see a lot of Oath. It's a deck that people like to play. It's relatively fun to do so in paper, and a lot of people have built it already, so you see a little bit of it. But yeah, generally for me, I'd be more thinking about tending towards the Lurus combo decks. Even Lurus PO has okay matchup. Obviously, Jewel is one of the worst matchups you have, and generally you want to play PO when Frog is overrepresented, and we haven't been seeing that in the numbers. So maybe tuning the deck a little to be more comfortable against this spread on the top, especially Jewel. Like Jewel has been very hard. We've seen PO trying to stand into the 4 commandeers in the sideboard, and that has been okay-ish, but some people are starting to abandon it because if you don't find it, if you don't play against Jewel, there's really not that much that is going to help you against your other matchups. You don't want to commandeer a Doomsday, for example. Things like those. And like in these matchups where, especially Doomsday, where your opponent has 1 mana counter spells for stuff, you don't want to go 3-4-1 and then lose to like a Fluster or a Daze or Misdirection or something like that. So generally speaking, I'd feel very comfortable playing Breach. I would not feel comfortable playing Initiative, especially Doomsday. It's just free for the Doomsday player to play Initiative, and we've seen those players do well. The one thing that I would say though is that right now these two decks, which are relatively strong into the meta, do not have a lot of players. They are relatively hard to pilot, or it's not just a deck that you can pick up and start doing okay with, and so that might be inhibiting those numbers. Also, at least for myself, I know that I don't have enough time lately to be playing challenges, so those results don't appear. So, take it with a grain of salt. I do think that those two decks are relatively well positioned right now. And again, because of how much Oath we have, that is definitely putting like pressure on the blue-black Lurus decks from coming in and starting to attack the meta. Like, as you can see, like, except for PO, which obviously is bad, but like because of all of these other combo decks, PO is not seeing as many numbers. We could see a resurgence of Frog should these Oath decks start falling back. I'm also pretty interested to see these blue-white versions, and we'll talk about 2 of them. And the reason for that is that they can play into the Oath matchup much better, not only because you have Swords to Plowshare, sure, and Atraxa make it into the game, and you need to control it, but also you have a lot of tools. White is one of the best at like removing things from play, and so as an auxiliary color, it does a lot of work. The biggest problem for blue-white generally is a lack of a clock, especially if you're in Lurus, because you don't have access to Murktide Regent, and so that is where we're trying to start to figure out where we're gonna go. So coming back to the decks, I wanted to go over a few of them that I found very interesting. So first is this version of Jewel that is playing with 4 Displacer Kittens and where is this card? The High in the Ceiling / Spectral Restitching. This is just basically to blink all of your jewels or rings or whatever. The rings just to reset them. You're not getting the protection, but for Jewel you do get the mana, and so it's kind of like a sort of instead of the PO. This version is a lot higher on just blinking its own things with Mightstone, drawing you 2 cards, Jewel. Just resetting the ring can sometimes be fine, even though it's usually your least preferred option. Resetting Karn, I think there might be, no, there's no Tezzeret here. But yeah, a pretty interesting way to build it, and also I suspect also gives you sufficient color. Yeah, 21 is better than general. You lack the ability of copying this because you don't play the Metamorph, and also makes your deck be a little worse against Bowmaster. You can kill it with the Mightstone, but it's not the same as just, the Metamorph. And also, like, this very interesting that I found, there's like 4 Hamlets for what I assume has to be Wasteland or Bazaar. Very interesting because you just have to draw into it and it doesn't power any of your cards. Haven't played this deck, but it's interesting to see Petrify Hamlet. At least in Legacy, it's making a big incursion and enabling these like big Tron decks that are kind of like wreaking havoc. So interesting to see where this goes for this deck. We also saw this Esper Tinker that I was mentioning that Chess Knight was playing. Actually pretty interesting. Really like these stakes, and most of the decks that Chess Knight plays are also always very interesting. Finalist for the Showcase Qualifier too, so he's a solid player, although some of his brews, or their brews rather, are a little out there. But yeah, here we see just the kind of like an adaptation of the Esper, or the blue-white initiative rather. And this is Esper, quote-unquote, because you're never casting Citadel or the Sphinx, so you can think of it as just blue-white initiative in a way. The other initiative deck I found was a little lackluster. It was playing like Riddlers and the Seasoned Engineer. Those never seemed to pop off, and in fact every time that I played against it, it felt like the deck was not really where you want it to be. This feels a lot more sensible to me, because the thing usually that makes initiative powerful is disruption plus a fast clock, right? And in this other matchup in blue-white, usually you're getting paid for having Force of Will and Ancest, unlike the power, blue power, sorry, and then not dying immediately to things like on the draw or before you can establish your lock piece. A lot of the times you have to move very deep in initiative and you just get like a just white blue adventure or whatever, and then you die on the crackback. So this version is a little bit more responsible in that sense, where we have about the same amount of defense with 6 forces plus a couple of Flusterstorms, but also we are putting in some punches like Tinker, Karn, etc. Initiative, obviously, it is hard for this deck to go turn 1 initiative, but it is not impossible either. And with the full suite of flow state and force stock-ups, which is a little interesting because that means that, and if we can see in the sideboard, this deck does not play any null rods, which is actually pretty scary. You only have 1 Karn as that type of effect. So yeah, relatively interesting. Sideboard that is just like very scope to beat Oath in 4 priests, and trying to go a little faster with like the full suit of like the White Plumes. Sphinx as a card that generally we don't see that much or have as much power anymore. It's okay, honestly, against Dredge, but lately it's just been difficult to make it work. So interesting to see this, especially because lately we had seen this Blightsteel Colossus as the pivot for Tinker. Lattice is just part of the Karn board. I personally would see a portable hole here, or even like Crypt or something like that. There's very, very little Dredge hate, quote unquote, right? Like Containment Priest I just never like as as Dredge Hate. It takes a long time to come in. But in a full Moxen deck, it might make more sense. How many white sources, untapped white sources do we have? Like 5 and 4 fetches, so 9. It's a little low, but still possible. I guess the Pearl is another one. A little difficult to get it in place in time, and you have a lot of quote-unquote air. Like, you're trying to find your sources, but like I've already seen these decks with like flow states for stock-ups, and you get a lot of cards, but you're not advancing the board realistically. So you want to play in a way that you have a threat, and then this is just recouping you from your forces. But there's not that many threats either. Like, you have these as threats. I guess you could think of Mystical for Tinker as another threat, but like, you're relatively light on threats that can do things. And so, a very interesting deck. We'd love to know what their spread was. I do like this direction a little bit more, because you are putting more pressure, right? Like, the problem that Blue-White had is that you can answer the first couple of goes, but then if you don't put something to move your board state forward, it's kind of like very lackluster. So yeah, anyway, moving on to this one. So this was one of the Blue-White decks that we saw. This one does not play flow state, so it's a little more on the Tamiyo side, putting a lot of pressure on these 3 Lavinias in the main deck, and just overall a spectacular amount of counter spells for this deck. Like, 2 Singing Stupors, which I am not super clear why we're doing this, plus 3 bubbles. Like, this deck is definitely just trying to take advantage of like this section here, which I am not super like. I've tried Tamiyo, and multiple of us have tried Tamiyo in Legacy, in Vintage, because it's so good in Legacy that we're like, okay, well, this has to be broken in Vintage. And on those matchups where you get to like buy back a couple time wells, it feels spectacular, but generally it's just like not quite in there, especially in a deck that you want to be playing Stony Silences. Kind of like this. It's an interesting take. I don't know that this is where I would come when trying to make these things happen, and I also don't like that it doesn't have any flow states, but it did pretty well. I believe it was one of the top 8. So they went 4-2 in the challenge. I would change it a little if I were to play it, and I would change it in this direction more. So here we see a much different take. So here we're playing Thundertrap Trainers and Wan Shitong as our creatures of choice. We are not playing Lavinia. I think it might be in the sideboard. No, not even in the sideboard, which I think Lavinia is very powerful, but sometimes, depending on what you're playing against, it may not be exactly what you need. I don't like that it doesn't have a bubble. This Mana Crypt is a little strange, because you are theoretically at the end of the day a control deck, and there's also like no Wastelands, no Stripman, which, you know, it's more towards the, you know, I'm gonna play my spells and try to get from there, and much less on the disruption that we usually see from Frog. It is playing basically the same level of counter spells as the other one. However, it is doing the 4 Lorients just to support these 4 flow states. So if we separate the deck based on just like instants and sorceries, we see a bit of a way more responsible spread, where we have enough to just generally put everything together. Like 15 sorceries is a good number. Plus this archive can help us put them into the graveyard, stuff like that. One of the difficulties of building Blue-White is just threats. Trainers don't close the game fast enough against anything, and Wan Shitong is getting a little better now that we see less Bowmasters, since even if you played 4x 100, it is a 1/1 when it enters the battlefield, so it can be sniped by any of the Bowmasters, right? So it's tend to be a little bit of a weak play. This Brainstorm, when we're not playing Tamiyo, I also don't quite love, but it's a little more in the direction that I would want to go. Not sure about the no Wastelands either, but our spells are bigger, so just playing Wastelands is a little difficult. When you're playing Frog, you're relying on the Frog to bring the work for you. Here we have a bunch of 3s, and you know, it's a little harder to to justify. Rest in Peace is a interesting card that we are starting to see a lot in Legacy for the white decks, and might be we will start seeing it in Vintage. It's just a limiter for flow state since it requires cards in graveyard to go. A little bit of a spread. This path I probably would just put Erode, although the only principal card that you really care about might just be Karn. And just overall, like you can see, there's quite a lot of dredge hate here. 6 cards is pretty fine since you don't have wastelands to combat it. So overall, another interesting take on the blue-white control versions. Without Tamio and instead displaying the standard trap trainer, stuff like that. I'm not fully sure about the standard traps, and it's interesting to see that this deck does not play like the, what's his name? The Sink into Stupor that usually these decks play as an alternative to be able to get a land, but the other one we were seeing was playing 2 Stupors without any of the Thunder Traps. So yeah, overall, we're starting to see this evolution on blue-white. Just trying to play flow states, and like I was mentioning, about a third of the decks were playing it. So that's about as much as I have for you this week. Hopefully by next week we'll see where flow state is settling and start to get people. I think we have maybe like 1 more week of experimentation before people start to just settle into the minutia. Those of us who are going to NYSE, where you're not trying anything crazy for the decks, you're just trying to improve the matchups that you think are going to be more likely. Like in my case, when I was practicing for the showcase, I thought of like Gorilla Shaman to beat the Hexing Squelcher from PO because I was expecting a heavy presence of PO in the showcase. And so that sort of stuff is what I think we're going to start seeing maybe 2 weeks before the event. But anyway, that's about as much as I have for you today. And so thanks for watching and see you later.